our evolution when we didn't guide life by distrusting our instincts, and had to think about it, and had to purposely arrange and discipline and push our lives around in accordance with foresight and words and systems of symbols, accountancy, calculation, and so on. And then we worry. Once you start thinking about things, you worry as to whether you've thought enough.
Grab a hold, take my hand and follow me. Where we're going, there are things for the eye to see. When we're over there, you'll feel it all around. Let it all come through, our love for you. There ain't a thing that will frighten you. This peace of mind flooding all over you. When you whistle loud, the clouds will spin to sound. Over and around, it shakes all of the proud. All of the proud. Don't you wanna separate your body from your mind? Don't you wanna dance with the devil to see what you can find? Don't you wanna feel the thunder deep inside your waking slumber? Don't you wanna wake up knowing where you do belong? Where you do belong. Powerful, compassion, love, brothers of your brothers. We'll get back up together. Across you, Lord, my entire world. Lord, have mercy. My mind is thirsty. Come along and follow me. Light of day, the dark of night will oscillate all throughout your life. When you don't divide, then you will be fine. But if you don't abide, you'll be pushed aside. Apropos, it's time to go. Come along and don't say goodbye. Open wide, open up your mind. Let all of your spirit flow. Now you're gonna find peace flow through your mind. Breathe all of it in, burn right through your skin. Right through your skin. Don't you wanna separate your body from your mind? Don't you wanna dance with the devil to see what you can find? Don't you wanna feel the thunder deep inside your waking slumber? Don't you wanna wake up knowing where you do belong? Where you do belong.
Good morning, guys. It's Tuesday, the 20th of March, 2018, and it's almost 11 a.m. in the morning. Welcome to the first of the podcasts on the subject of the Golden Chain of Homer, where I will start to discuss chapters 1 and 2 of the Golden Chain. I apologise for the sunglasses, but I have the sun. It's early in the morning, the sun is low and it's pointing right in my face so that I can get good lighting for recording this. And I was going to be recording in 4K this morning on the new GoPro, but I've discovered that GoPro in their infinite wisdom have decided to change the shape of their audio port, and my mini USB lavalier doesn't fit in the GoPro 5 audio port, so I'm going to have to do a bit of experimenting with the 5. I know it's got a better mic system than the previous versions of GoPro, to see whether or not I can record without the lavalier or try and find a new mini USB that fits their device. So let's get started with the discussion of chapters 1 and 2 of the Aurea Catena Homeri, the Golden Chain of Homer. The first thing I want to make clear about this while we're discussing the early chapters of the Golden Chain is that the men who were responsible for developing the knowledge that is encapsulated in the Golden Chain of Homer did not just make this stuff up. These guys were serious Hermetists and considered themselves to be scientists. And in fact, their attitude towards investigating nature was the same kind of attitude that we find in the men who are today considered to be the creators or innovators of the beginning of the modern age of science. People like Robert Boyle of the Royal Society. They were occultists to a certain degree, but they were also desperate to formulate the systems and rules upon which modern science would develop. So the Rosicrucians, who originally discovered, put together the knowledge that we find described in the Golden Chain, were men like this. They weren't flaky, new age occultists who basically just made up ideas out of their mind, and because they sounded lovely, they became accepted by a large crowd of other new agey people. These men were trying very hard to find out the facts about the nature of our reality and not just the physical side. A large part of their concern was the non-physical, or what we today would routinely probably call the spiritual side of our reality. So the knowledge that we find described in the Golden Chain is partly a product of information that these men in the 16 and 1700s inherited from previous centuries of occult knowledge. They studied the works of more ancient esoteric philosophers, and they adopted some of those ideas, or at least used them as the basis for their investigation. And some of the knowledge we find presented was the product of their interpretation of what they witnessed in certain laboratory processes. And today we would refer technically to those laboratory processes as primarily being alchemical in nature. So these men practiced alchemy in early laboratory conditions, which are not really the same as laboratories as we would think of them and know them today. And when they carried out these alchemical processes, they deduced certain things about the nature of reality from those experiments and interpreted the meaning of those experiments according to tradition and according to their common sense and their reason. So the information we'll be discussing now is how these men built a picture of the world based on the various avenues of investigation that they had open to them. And we need to remember something important here. I'm not saying that any of their interpretation of the reality of nature is accurate. What I'm saying is, this is how these men saw things. Deciding whether or not what they saw and how they interpreted what they saw was an accurate interpretation is the next step in the process. So first we need to discuss exactly what it is that they saw, how they interpreted it, and therefore what they believed about the nature of reality. So as I said previously, the Golden Chain is not a huge book, or at least the original version of it before people started attaching annotations and commenting on the book. It was largely a small book. So for example, the first chapter of the Golden Chain is only a small paragraph, and the first section of the Golden Chain is called Of the Generation of Things. And so what they're going to first start discussing is how everything that we witness in the world around us was generated, how it came about, where it comes from, and the process by which all matter, all circumstances around us are generated. And this is important because the information, the discussion that they provide about how things were generated forms the very ground basis upon which all Hermetic philosophy is founded. And so when we look at other subjects like ritual or divination or astrology or magic or alchemy, all of these things had their roots in the kind of ideas that we're now going to discuss. So chapter 1 of this first section is entitled What Nature Is. And it begins like this. Nature comprehends the visible and invisible creatures of the whole universe. What we call nature especially is the universal fire, or anima mundi. So this is the first half of the paragraph, which is chapter 1. And what the author is saying here is that nature, which is the way things behave, the nature of things, the way they behave, their condition, the rules and laws which they encompass and express, nature encompasses the visible and invisible creatures of the universe. So already at the beginning of the Golden Chain we're seeing a discussion of the concept that there is two sides to our reality. A visible side, which is physical reality, which can be experienced by our senses and measured by scientific instruments, and an invisible side to nature, which we know about because we have access to that through our mind, but which modern science largely ignores. And that nature expresses itself through a universal fire, which the alchemists had a technical term for, which they described by the Latin term anima mundi, or spirit of the world. And by world they don't mean our planet, they mean reality as we experience it, as we see it, and as we don't see it from the invisible, as we're a living creature. So world it basically means reality in all of its aspects as we experience it in our environment while we're alive. So nature expresses itself through a universal fire which makes up all creatures, in other words all things, all living systems in the physical and non-physical worlds, and it is a universal fire. It's in everything, and it is known as the anima mundi, or spirit of the world. This universal fire is what the golden chain describes as being the source of everything. And so this is the one thing that we hear talked about in the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, the one thing from which everything else develops. A single universal fire which makes up all creatures, all living systems in the invisible and visible worlds, and which we technically refer to as the anima mundi. So the second half of this paragraph goes like this. This universal fire, or anima mundi, fills the whole system of the universe, and therefore is a universal agent, omnipresent, it's everywhere, and endowed with an unerring instinct, and manifests itself in fire and light. It is the first creature of divine omnipotence. So again, we're presented with the idea that the word creature is best translated as living system. The first living creature that's created or exists in the whole universe, in the world, and that this creature is in everything. It is a universal agent, and by the term agent they mean active principle. So it's like the fuel in your car, which allows your car to move, and part of its being is the plan and ability for that movement to happen. So it's an agent, it's the thing which gets stuff done. Our author also tells us it is endowed with an unerring instinct, and this is a really important little phrase because it doesn't use technical language entirely, it is often overlooked. But this universal fire has inherent in it an unerring instinct, and that means it has an intention, an instinct, an intention or a will to achieve particular ends. And by unerring, it means that it has the ability to go after and achieve those ends without being distracted or twisted away from that task. So this universal fire, this anima mundi, or spirit of the world, also has a will, which means there is a plan in it which has a path and a goal. So it has a way of achieving a goal, not just a thing that it wants to achieve, but the ability to achieve it. It's an agent, and it has a plan for achieving that goal. It is endowed with an unerring instinct. And then we are told that this universal fire manifests itself in fire and light. In other words, it also exists before manifestation. It exists before manifestation, and then it can manifest itself. So it's in the invisible and in the visible worlds, and it manifests itself as fire and light. So when we see what the alchemists call elemental fire, which is actual physical fire, heat and light, this is a manifestation of the universal spirit of the world, the universal agent or fire. When it gets to the point where it actually manifests, arrives in the physical reality, its first manifestation, its first form of manifestation is in actual fire and in light. So this is what the first chapter basically wants to tell us. It wants to tell us that all of reality, everything that we experience in reality, our mind, our physical bodies, our physical environments, the minds of other things, language, atoms, molecules, goldfish and dinosaurs, all come from a single source, which the Emerald Tablet refers to as the one thing. And now what the Golden Chain is telling us is it's giving us a very technical description of what that one thing is. And it says it's a universal fire, which is a universal agent, which is omnipresent, it's everywhere and in everything. That means everything right down to atoms and subatomic particles, as well as in people and buildings and in blue whales. And that this fire has an unerring instinct. In other words, it has a purpose, it's got a plan, it's got a way of getting that plan worked out, and it's got a goal it's heading towards. And this is what is commonly referred to in more mystical literature as the will of God. It is a will to achieve something, and not just the will to achieve it, but the means of carrying out that will and a plan for carrying out that will. And then that when this invisible fire, universal fire, starts to reach the physical reality, the physical level of existence, its first manifestation is in fire and in light. Okay, so now we're on to chapter 2, and the title of chapter 2 is How All Things Proceed Therefrom. In other words, we're now going to hear the author describe how everything in our reality emanates out of this universal fire. And the first passage reads like this: Thus God created first this invisible fire, and endowed it with an unerring instinct, and a capacity to manifest itself in 3 principles. So there's a whole bunch more of information even in just that short passage. This single thing, this one thing, which is the source of everything else in the universe, is not God itself, but God created it. This universal agent with unerring instinct is not God, but it's something that God created in order to produce all of our reality. It not only has an unerring instinct, but it was also created so that it could manifest itself, or it contains in itself 3 principles. Now it is common to, this is a technical term, the word principle, when you're studying alchemy, the 3 principles of alchemy. It's often spelt P-R-I-N-C-P-L-E-S, which the definition of that is like a concept or a rule which governs some system or some belief or some behavior. Principle. But it is my belief that back in the time when English language had no standard spelling, which actually wasn't that long ago, before somebody decided to write the first dictionary and standardize the spelling in English, in Old English, I believe that the word principle, as in the 3 alchemical principles, has the wrong spelling. It should be P-R-I-N-C-P-A-L, principle, the foremost thing, the three principles. In other words, the three things or conditions that exist over and above everything else. They are principal, above everything else. So often in my writings you'll see that when I talk about the three alchemical principles, I don't spell it the standard way, Principle. I spell it PAL on the end, principal, foremost thing. So this is the next concept. God created the one thing, this universal agent, that was the original building block of the rest of reality. He put into it an unerring instinct, in other words, a will, a way of carrying out that will, and a plan. And this unerring instinctive fire, universal fire, which is the universal agent, also contains a mechanism which allows it to manifest in three conditions, the three alchemical principles. And anybody who studied, for example, the Golden Dawn system, or just general, more serious mainstream occultism, will have come across the term the three principles. Anyone who's studied basic level Kabbalah will know that the three mother letters in the Kabbalah are often referred to by mainstream occultists as being the same as the three principles of alchemy. So next, our author's going to make 3 points. And point 1 is, in its original, most universal state, it is perfectly invisible. This is our universal agent or universal fire. It's in its original state, in its very first condition, it is perfectly invisible. It is immaterial. In other words, it does not exist in any way, shape or form as a physical substance. It is also cold, and it occupies no space. So it is a cold fire. In other words, it's totally the opposite of the kind of fire that we're familiar with from physical existence, which is hot. And it occupies no space, which again is emphasizing that it has no physical properties which can be seen or experienced or measured by science. In this tranquil state, it is of no use to us. It can't be used in the physical realm in this state because it has no physical properties. Yet in this unmoved state, so it's entirely passive at the same time, it is omnipresent. So in other words, when God first created this universal agent, it's passive. So it is a fire that is totally passive, which is why it can be cold, because obviously physical fire that we're aware of is highly active and is hot. So it's passive, it's invisible, it's immaterial, totally non-physical. It doesn't occupy physical space or even the concept of space that we can think of at all. And it's everywhere. It's omnipresent. It is everywhere. Absolutely, infinitely everywhere. And in this condition, as human beings who want to investigate and manipulate our reality in order to learn from it and make use of it, this original condition of the universal fire is totally useless to us because we can't access it in any kind of way because it is invisible and non-material. So that's the first point our author wanted to make. The second point he makes, point number 2, in its second state, it is manifested by motion or agitation into light. In this state, it is separated out of the chaos. In other words, the first original cold, immaterial, invisible state is the chaos of the alchemists, the original chaos, which some alchemists refer to as the chaos. Then God said, "Let there be light." Let's wait for that plane. Yet it is still cold. When gently moved or agitated, it manifests warmth and heat. In the case of all frictions and in fermentation of most things. So I'm going to read that again, the whole second point. In its second state, it is manifested by motion or agitation into light. In this state, it is separated out of chaos. When God said, "Let there be light," yet it is still cold. When gently moved or agitated, it manifests warmth or heat, as in the case of all frictions and fermentation of moist things. So this universal fire begins cold and invisible and immaterial, and then an intelligence, a supreme intelligence that created this universal fire, moves that cold, chaotic condition into a second state, which is defined by motion. And that motion causes warmth and light to manifest. So our author is also drawing our attention to the fact that that opening passage in the Old Testament of the Bible, in Genesis, where God said, "Let there be light," he's saying that this little chunk out of the Bible is the second state of the universal fire, and it's as it is described by a Kabbalist in his poetic language. When God said, "Let there be light," what that means is that that cold, universal, invisible, non-material fire is moved. And when motion is created in that original chaos, that chaos, chaos, universal chaos, the original chaos, when motion is created in that chaos, then heat and light are produced. And then in order to draw our attention to the fact that we need to remember that all this knowledge is produced from not only ancient wisdom that was being handed down, but from laboratory experiment, our author draws our attention back to two processes which are very important in alchemy, and that is friction and fermentation, or what is sometimes called putrefaction. So our author tells us that this cold state, which is then produces warmth and light, we also see the same condition in fermentation or putrefaction and in friction. If you take two substances and rub them together very quickly, like the palms of your hands for example, friction is caused between the skin on the palms of your hands and heat is produced. So he is using fermentation and friction to point out that this is what is going on inside this original universal cold fire, that there is a kind of a fermentation happening or putrefaction, and friction is being caused in that state, and this fermentation and friction is causing heat and light to be produced. So now his third point. Number 3, when collected in sufficient quantity and violently agitated, it is manifested into burning fire. This continues burning as long as it is agitated and has a fit subject to act upon. when that fails, in other words, it's no longer agitated and no longer has a subject to act upon, it returns to its first state of tranquil universality. In the character of the burning fire, it manifests light and heat. Thus, and now he's going to show us in 3 sub-points how that light and heat comes about. A, we say in its first most universal state it is perfectly invisible and immaterial. B, in its second state of manifestation it is visible in light but remains cold and immaterial. So we're talking about a non-physical state of light. It's visible, but it's still cold and immaterial. So this is a similar concept to the astral light. You can see the light, but it's visible, but it's immaterial. And C, in its third state of heat and burning, it is visible, hot or burning, and becomes somewhat material as it occupies room or space while in this state. So this third state, point C, is actual physical fire. Anything in this world which is hot, for example like electrical fire, or when you burn a log, these things are the invisible universal fire finally manifest at the physical level of reality. So that points A, B and C are a recapitulation in short form of everything that he has said before this point. So he now continues, you have seen how 3 distinct powers of the universal spirit, but it possesses still more and even some inconceivable powers. So these 3 original powers in points A, B and C are the 3 first principles of the universal fire. The first principle being that it is cold and invisible and immaterial. The second, that it manifests in visible light but still remains cold and immaterial. And the third principle is that it is physical, occupies space, is hot and has light. So he's now saying, I've described those 3 special powers of the universal fire, but there are still more powers that it has. We have told you that the universal spirit is endowed with an unerring instinct, working by the most simple and nearest way. It has also, besides its already mentioned conspicuous qualities, 2 occult powers. They are attracting and repulsing. And these 2 powers are inconceivably great. So in this passage what we're being told is, first of all, that while the universal fire is trying to work out its plan, the plan of its will or intent towards its goal, it always works by the shortest and easiest route. And this is what we refer to in Hermetism as the law of economy. It always works by the shortest and easiest route. That's just a very simple way of saying that the universal fire doesn't waste anything. It gets the job done as quickly as possible wherever it is working its way out, and it's working by the easiest and simplest methods. Not complicated, the easiest and simplest methods. Then finally in that passage we're being told that there are 2 more important powers in this universal fire, and that is the power of attraction and repulsion. And the author says these are occult powers. In other words, they are hidden in the universal fire, like secret forces. Then in the next short passage the author tells us, we see various instances of the law of attraction and repulsion in thunder and lightning, in earthquakes, in hurricanes, and in the surprising effects of gunpowder. One of the reasons why this kind of passage is inserted in here is that he wants to remind us that we're supposed to be looking at nature in order to discover her secrets. So he's describing some things that happen in nature and around us, and in human invention as well, where the laws of attraction and repulsion are displayed. Then in the next paragraph, in the next passage, we have, when God created this universal fire, he gave it the power to become material. And we've seen that described already. That's one of the three principles. And this ability to become material begins with the agitating of the original chaos and its friction and its fermentation. That is to become vapor, humidity, water, and earth. Although that fire in its own universal nature is and remains centrally the same, thus you see the beginning of the four elements. So we've had the single source described, which is the original cold universal fire. We've had its binary state described, the law of attraction and repulsion. Then he tells us it also has three powers, and they were described in those points A, B, and C, the three principles. And now he's moving on to the next state that the universal fire develops into, and that is into the state of the four elements. And I'll just read that passage again. When God created this universal fire, he gave it the power to become material. That is, to become vapor, and by that they basically mean a gas or an air. Humidity, same thing. Water, and earth. So he's describing three of the four elements there: air, water, and earth, because we've already discussed the manifestation of fire. Although that universal fire in its own universal nature is and remains centrally the same, in other words, inside of everything, no matter what that fire evolves into, inside all of those things, inside everything in reality, that universal fire still remains the same in its infinite universal field of a cold, immaterial, invisible fire. That doesn't disappear. It doesn't change into something and stop being the first thing it was. Because that first thing is infinite and universal, everything else comes out of it, but it still remains there. Thus you see the beginning of the four elements. In other words, once we get down to the physical level of how all this happens, how all this unfolds, the universal fire, at the physical level we get the four elements appearing. And now he gives us three more points about this. And point one is burning fire. So we've already just seen that described. Vapor or humidity mixed with cold fire constitutes atmospheric air. So he's telling us that the air that's in our atmosphere around us is constructed out of humidity mixed with cold fire, that cold original universal fire. Then air, which still more condensed, becomes water. If we look up into the sky, we see clouds forming in the atmosphere, and that's what he's describing. He's saying that those clouds in the atmosphere come out of air, and in a manner that's actually correct. Water can exist as a gas or a vapor, which is virtually invisible until it starts to condense, and then it compresses itself into liquid water. And that water, still further insissipated, becomes earth. And we know if you take atmospheric water, rain or snow or hail, and put it into a jar and let it basically putrefy or rot, that you will see a sediment fall out. And so that's basically what he's describing there. We know that earth comes out of water because if you let water putrefy, earth will, that pure clean water, because they don't know that anything is floating in there, they see a precipitated solid substance and they say, therefore earth will precipitate out of water. So he's kind of describing how in nature, things that we can see around us, we can see this process of the four elements arriving in physical reality, and how one element evolves out of the previous element. So he's going to recapitulate this again in the next passage. Originally, it was but one element, fire. And we're not talking here about hot fire, we're talking about that cold, universal, immaterial fire. Everything originally was fire, one single element. Thus, the universal fire became a vapor of immense extent, and by further insipation became a chaotic water, and out of this chaotic water the Creator separated light, that is, separated the universal invisible fire into light. Thus we see here that universal, at first invisible fire manifested in two principles, light and humidity. Therefore, out of light and water, God has created all things. And this is kind of like the end of the story kind of thing about the creative process. He, of course, is referring back to the Old Testament, Genesis, the original spirit which floated upon the water. That's what he means by water and fire. Out of water and fire were created everything. That original spirit is the fire. That great ocean or sea that the spirit moved upon, the waters, these were the two original states from which the entire universe was created. So we're being led to understand here, to follow the thread of the story through the Old Testament, the early chapters of the early verses of Genesis, and he's trying to make the point, help us join the dots here, that those early verses in Genesis are discussing an Hermetic and a alchemical view of the universe. And this is very important. This is not just some poetic, airy-fairy, spiritual set of verses to describe the creation of reality in a cute way by a bunch of guys living in the eastern desert thousands of years ago. This is a specific, technical, scientific document, the opening verses of Genesis, described in a poetic language, but based on an Hermetic and alchemical view of reality. What this tells us is that the original Kabbalists, and we're not talking about the kind of Kabbalists that people think of today when they study the Kabbalah, Jews or Hebrews who are deeply religious people but also have an esoteric bent to their understanding and so study Kabbalah. We're talking about very different kind of people. And these people, these original Kabbalists, who took their understanding and knowledge from more ancient cultures of Sumer and Egypt, were studying Hermetism and alchemy. And so when they decided to write religious documents or Kabbalistic religious documents, the very first opening passages in the book of Genesis, in the Torah, are Hermetic and alchemical, and there's no arguing about it. This view of how reality was created, which is provided by the opening chapters in the Golden Chain of Homer, is the same view that we see in the opening verses of Genesis, and that this tradition, this teaching, is very ancient and has still been preserved relatively intact. The problem is, on the popular and mainstream level of Hermetic study, very little about any of this stuff is known, let alone understood. For the most part, the book, The Golden Chain of Homer, is only known about by people who study alchemy. And even then, most students of alchemy who study at the popular or mainstream level don't understand this book at all. And they certainly don't make the connection, often don't make the connection, not always, some people do. They certainly often do not make the connection between ancient Sumer, ancient Egypt, very, very early Hebrew Kabbalism, and Hermetism and alchemy. Some people will pay lip service to this idea, but often they have no idea of how those connections happen, and they don't recognize any evidence of it. But here, in the Golden Chain of Homer, which was written 5,000 years possibly before the original concepts that we see in Genesis were first laid down by Hebrew Kabbalists, 4,000 or 5,000 years later, we see the same story being told, but in a more technical way. The author of the Golden Chain is saying, behind the simple and beautiful poetry of the opening verses of the Torah, there is actually a technical science, and I'm going to explain that science to you. And so that's what the Golden Chain is doing in its opening chapters. In the next passage, we read, water was the first condensation or corporification of the universal fire, which water nevertheless in its centre was and remains fire. So again, he's telling us that the fire doesn't disappear when it changes into water. The water just simply evolves out of the fire, but the fire remains, full of life and activity. So the life and activity in water, its fluidness, alchemists say that comes from the fire which is hidden inside of that water. And the more so as it is assisted by its equal, the light, separated out of it, as much as was necessary for the creating of all immaterial and material beings, and in success of time for their maintenance. So this original fire and light and the original water, from which all things were created, invisible and invisible, enough of each of these two things, the water and the fire, is produced in order to create all of reality, and also in order to maintain everything that was created. Of the separated light we have spoken before. We have now to consider its first body, humidity and water. This water differs in regard to rarefaction or density. If rarefied, in other words, if made volatile to a certain degree, it constitutes air. In other words, if you evaporate water, it turns into a gas, air. That is fire predominating above water. But if condensed to a degree, it becomes water, or humidity predominating over fire. Nevertheless, in both, that is in their centre lays concealed fire, or the universal spirit. So he's just reminding us that as each step in the process unfolds, that original universal fire is not being lost. It's remaining there behind the stage that's just manifested. The next stage in the process, the next stage in the process, so it's piling up. And the stuff underneath is still there, acting as the basis for the next step, which acts for the basis of the next step, and so on. So each level of the process as it unfolds is dependent on the step before it, which doesn't disappear. And that behind all of this, the universal original fire remains. As soon as the air gets deprived of its universal fire, which animates it and renders it elastic, it becomes immediately putrid, and thereby declines lower down, becoming humidity, mud, earth, and immovable. Deprived of fire or of the animated air, it becomes putrid, condenses still further, and becomes earth, immovable. The idea here is that each step down in the process of the four elements unfolding requires putrefaction and fermentation and a deprivation or lack of connection immediately with the universal fire. So each of the elements, as they become more dense, has more further disconnection with the original universal fire, even though it is still there underneath. God has ordained it so that the universal spirit, by means of humidity, should work in all things, because humidity mixes easily with everything, by means of which the spirit can soften, penetrate, generate, destroy, and regenerate all things. And that's an important little statement there. That spirit can soften, penetrate, generate, destroy, and regenerate all things. So that universal fire causes everything to be born or created. It feeds and maintains things once they have been created. It kills them off and it regenerates them. It governs all of those processes, and that's a theme that is repeated through the Golden Chain a number of times. Thus, humidity or water is the body, the vehicle, and the tool, but the spirit or fire is the operator, the universal agent, and the fabricator of all natural things. It creates everything. This universal fire fills that immense space in the universe between the heavenly bodies. So it's talking about the void of space, and it says that that cold void of space is actually the original universal fire. And as it has the power to become material, it generates a subtle vapor or invisible, most subtle humidity, its first passive principle. It causes there a gentle reaction, and a general, gentle, most subtle fermentation takes place universally. And by this reaction, the universal acid is everywhere generated, which we can deem nothing else but the most subtle, incorporeal, in other words non-physical, niter spiritus mundi, the universal spirit of the world, outwardly cold and inwardly fire. So when you look at water, for example, and put your hand in it, physically and outwardly it's cold, but the reason why that water is so flexible and can move and slop around, alchemists say that's because hidden inside of it is a fire which makes it flexible like that. And internally in that, if we could reach into the internal parts of water to feel that fire, there it would be hot, internally fire. Thus the spiritual incorporeal niter, or universal acid, we deem the second invisible change of the universal fire, generated out of chaotic, invisible humidity, and as this approaches the atmospheres of the heavenly bodies, and he's talking about planets, it becomes gradually more material until it meets an alkaline passive principle, and he means by that mineral salts, but a particular kind of a mineral salt, wherein it fixes itself, in other words, it becomes manifest, and forms native niter, which is a particular kind of a chemical. So that from Spiritus Mundi, originally, the cold universal fire, it becomes a mineral salt, which alchemists refer to as niter. So that mineral salt, which appears as the invisible fire comes down into the atmospheres of planets, manifests itself. The very first thing it becomes, according to traditional Hermetic doctrine, is a mineral salt, which the old alchemists referred to as niter. Thus we say, not without good reason, that the solar rays of light, in other words, the radiation which comes out from a star, are nothing else but a most subtle spiritual spiritus mundi. In other words, that solar radiation is the most volatile, rarefied form of the spiritus mundi in physical reality, which gradually becomes more and more nitrous as it approaches the earth. But sea salt in the ocean, animating the atmosphere with fire and life, and thereby giving elasticity to the air and life and preservation to the water. Every man of common understanding may learn what nature is and its origin. So up until this point now, the author has basically described not only how the four elements unfold from the original chaos, but he's now saying as they unfold, this is how they actually become physical. This is how they appear, flowing out of the sun, through space, to the atmospheres of planet, and then start to become physical. We see that between the firmament and our earth, in other words, he means between space and the surface of our planet, continual vapors, clouds and fogs, which ascend like a transpiration of the earth. In other words, they're vapors which kind of are breathed out of the earth and are sublimed upwards, evaporate upwards, by the central heat of the earth. This chaotic water and vapors contain and are the first matter of all things, and although thus appears very simple before our eyes, yet it is twofold, as it contains fire and humidity, the invisible in the visible. The fire or spirit is the agent, and water is the patient or patent. So now he's saying that atmospheric moisture, the gases, the humidity that's in our atmosphere, is the prima materia, the first matter of our planet manifest. It's also the universal prima materia, or the universal chaos manifest. The first place it manifests on this planet is in atmospheric moisture. And he's saying that in atmospheric moisture are two principles: humidity, or water, and that invisible fire is contained in its center. Whosoever wishes to arrive at the fountain of secret wisdom, and he's talking primarily here about the secrets of alchemy, Let him mind this well. In other words, understand what he's talking about here. And let him go with this central point of truth to the circumference, and forever imprint on his memory that from fire and water, or spirit enclosed in humidity, all things in the world are generated, preserved, destroyed, and regenerated. Whosoever comprehends this well will find no difficulty in analysing natural things, as he may easily volatilize the fixed and fix the volatile. A stinking subject he may convert into a pleasant smelling one. Out of poison he can make a solitary medicine, because he knows that all things proceed from one root and return to that root. The distinction is external and regards only the modification of the matter, which is more or less digested or fixed. Therefore, the philosophers, and he means Hermetic philosophers or alchemists, say that their matter is in all things, yet they have selected such subjects wherein the universal spirit is more more abundantly contained and more concentrated and more easier to obtain. Thus wise that spirit is all in all. So this is the last thing that our author says in chapter 2. That he's now described how the beginning of everything, the one source of everything, is that cold, invisible, immaterial, universal fire. And he's explained how that fire graduates down and becomes physical matter. And he says that during that process, the first place that the original chaos manifests on this planet, because this is a complete living system, it's a microcosm, so everything which is going on here is also going on in the greater universe. So there is a miniature and similar condition here of everything that's out there, which means here on this planet there has to be an original chaos, that watery state from which everything evolves. And he's saying that original chaotic state on our planet is atmospheric moisture, the humidity that we find in the air, which manifests in clouds, then rains down as water, and then through putrefaction precipitates an earth, which then becomes minerals. So he's finishing off by saying, if you want to understand nature, and by nature he means the original universal fire, all you have to do is understand what that atmospheric moisture is, what it contains, and what you can do with it. So here we are at the end of chapter 2, and we're going back to what I said at the beginning of this podcast, that these guys did not design this knowledge out of a new age airy-fairy spiritual concept that sounded cute. To them this is a science, and he's now explaining how that science came about. And for them it came about by analysing the nature of atmospheric moisture and what is in it, by dissecting that water in the laboratory, by discovering what can be done with it when you apply certain alchemical processes and principles. Then you can produce all of the things that we now find populating this world. The rest of the golden chain, after chapter 2, a little bit further down, but the basic, the core theme of the golden chain is a bunch of experiments which show you how to do this. He's then saying in those experiments, and this is how we figured out all this stuff, because we took water and we did all these weird things to them, and animals, plants, and minerals grew out of that fresh, clear atmospheric water, and therefore we know that the seeds for all of these things are in that water. And we also know where that water originally came from. We also know what it is that allows the seeds of all things to be in that atmospheric moisture. So here is the important lesson, and I'll keep repeating this because this is something that pop occultists, mainstream occultists, literally have no idea of. That the occult subjects which they are studying, like astrology, divination, magic, esoteric, ritual, all of these things have their origin in a science, in a scientific analysis of the nature of reality. And that at some time in our vast past history, human beings either figured this out for themselves, or something or someone from a more advanced civilization, more advanced understanding of the nature of reality, told human beings at that ancient time in the past. And from that, Hermetic science evolved. And that this science gave birth to divination, ritual, magic, laboratory, alchemy, so on and so forth. All the things that people involved with Hermetism get interested in, study and practice. That these things weren't just spiritually thought up from psychics or weird, airy-fairy people having visions. There is a physical science behind this, and therefore there is a connection between physical reality, actual chemicals and electricity and physics and solid matter and the forces which interact between material conditions and substances. In all of that is concealed the true esoteric nature of the universe. This is what the author of the Golden Chain is trying to tell us. Something else he is trying to tell us is that in very ancient writings, such as ancient Kabbalistic writings that were recorded by the original Hebrew Kabbalists, who were not like modern Kabbalists. These were not religious men, these were hardcore, for their era, hardcore scientists as well as occultists. They developed and recorded and understood and practiced a very scientific approach to esotericism. This is absolutely important because one of the common theories that's had amongst the popular level of occultism is that nothing spiritual can be proved and science cannot measure, weigh up and calculate anything spiritual, and therefore spiritual science or spiritual reality or the spiritual world and community is something separate from science, and it's our little thing, and we don't care what anyone else thinks about it, we're going to believe all these things. That attitude is not accurate. It's not accurate at all. It is an attitude that is developed by people who do not understand what Hermetism or real occultism actually is. On top of this, one of the most important things about laboratory alchemy and about the alchemical tradition itself is that it was founded to teach these concepts, to make sure that the connection between science and spirit was not lost, and that there was a way of passing on that knowledge. And this is why, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, this is why alchemists refer to alchemy as the Hermetic science, because they say it's at the root of all the others. It's the thing which proves the other sciences, and it's the thing which keeps all those things within a tight bound of reason and predictability. This is why talking about alchemy at the beginning of Hermetism, like I am, is such an important thing. Because if you don't understand alchemy, at least in theory, then you virtually do not understand anything else about Hermetism at all. You don't really understand astrology, you don't really understand how ritual or divination works, and you don't understand magic. You might think you do, but if you don't understand the laws upon which all of these things are based, which are alchemical laws, then you don't understand these things. That doesn't mean to say that you might not be successful at, for example, practicing magic, but it means that you don't understand what it is that allows you to be successful. This is why it's important to study alchemy. And this is why the Golden Chain of Homer, by serious students of alchemy, is considered to be one of the most important texts in the entire canon of alchemical literature, because it's going back to the beginning and it's scientifically describing each stage of our reality, how it all came about. And not only that, it provides laboratory experiments which you yourself can do in order to prove the theories that the book is providing. And I'll just say again, as I'm about to close this podcast, I am not saying that everything that the author of this book says is a fact and is accurate and true. That's the first thing. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that the first thing we need to do is understand really what these people are describing in this book. Because books like this are often misunderstood, or often people just don't understand them at all. It's important to understand what the author of this book and the people behind him, the guys who did all this work and figured out all this stuff, what it is that they thought about the world, how they saw the world. And then, with our modern understanding of science, we can look at an accurate view of their view and begin to ask the questions of, well, can this really be proved or not? Is this actually accurate or not? And through that process, we can renovate the modern Hermetic tradition and get rid of all the garbage that has adhered to modern Hermetic teaching through misunderstanding, through outright lies and deception, through religion and through politics, and get back to the root truth about what's going on here. So it's taken me a while to get this podcast out, like I said previously in the channel update, because of going away on holiday. Over the last couple of weeks, weather conditions haven't been good for filming outside. I don't have the proper lighting to film inside very well, which is something I'm going to rectify shortly in the future, so that there is no reason for having to wait for good outdoor conditions, lighting, no wind, no rain, no neighbours being noisy. It's taken me a while to get this podcast out, but here we are. That's the first 2 chapters of the Golden Chain, and so the next podcast we'll look at the next chapter or 2, depending on how long they are and how much I can squeeze into the time I have. And we'll continue like this until we get to the end of the section on how things are generated. That's really the only part that I want to cover about this. The rest of that book you should then be able to have a good grasp of and understand if you want to actually make a serious study of that document. So thanks very much for watching if you've got this far. Again, apologies for taking so long. I'm back into a relatively stable work routine in my job after the next couple of weeks. So once that happens and I get my life sorted out again through different hours and a longer working period during the week, we'll be back into a routine of getting these podcasts out regularly and covering the kinds of subjects that some of you off the podcast have privately emailed me about. I just want to reassure everybody again, this is not just a flyby kind of a thing. I have intention here of discussing everything I understand about Hermetism. And there's a lot of subjects involved in that, including the magical tradition, laboratory alchemy, the process of initiation, minor subjects like astrology, divination, ritual. I'm going to cover the whole lot, and I'm going to talk about it in a lot of detail and in simple language that anybody can understand. So There'll be a lot of discussion of esoteric psychology, which most of you probably have no idea about and will not have heard about, but I'll discuss it all cleanly and clearly so you can understand how all of these things work, and then hopefully begin to start making productive, sincere and serious decisions about your esoteric study yourself in the future. Again, thanks for watching, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next podcast.
And so there came a point in our evolution when we didn't guide life by distrusting our instincts, and had to think about it, and had to purposely arrange and discipline and push our lives around in accordance with foresight and words and systems of symbols, accountancy, calculation, and so on. And then we worry. Once you start thinking about things, you worry as to whether you've thought enough.